So the print method and the average method for the grades class are quite a bit more straightforward than the read methods were. So I'm just going to do those in a single one. And you can play around with this and decide how you actually want your grades to be printed. I'm not going to do anything terribly fancy. Remember, this is a constant method because it doesn't change the grades object. One thing we might do is check to see if there are any grades to print. And we can use the empty method to do that. And if that's true, we can just see out and say no grades to print. Oh, you know what I did? I once again forgot that I am writing this to the O stream. Bad, bad, bad. And instead of using C out, I'm going to use out. And this is not a mistake. I declared a default argument of cout in the class definition, but you don't repeat the default argument in the implementation. You leave that off. So now if I have grades, then I just want to print them. And so I guess one question I've been talking about this being a grades for an individual student. It could also be grades for a class for a given assignment. So maybe I just print grades. Using new line characters here. What I want to do is, now that I've printed out this little header message, I can, and this is going to be very similar to the code fragment that we saw before, where we were illustrating how to iterate over a vector. And I don't know how many grades I have in my vector. I know that I have more than 0. It could just be 1. And so I want to use a for loop to iterate over the elements of the vector and print them. So I'm using the size method to tell me how many grades I have in my vector. Size returns an unsigned integer, so my loop variable here needs to be unsigned in order to avoid a type mismatch here when C++ makes this comparison. And I want to iterate over each element of the vector, so I'm incrementing by 1. Now I can simply print each grade. Remember, this is the entire vector grades, and to refer to a specific element of the vector, I use the subscript operator or the at method, and I print the grade. That's the end of my for loop. This is the end of my else, and that's the end of my print method. So if we look at the grades that I had before, the output will be something like grades, and then you'll get the grades 86, 85, 96, and 98, and this will go to the console when you call the print method. Okay. Now the average method is going to look very similarly, right? So we want to check to see if it's empty. And if there are no grades to average, then we want to say that, or we want to print that message. If we do have grades, instead of printing out some sort of a little header here or printing out the grades themselves, we're going to iterate, sum the grades, and then finally we're just going to divide. So remember, this method returns a double because that will be, in all likelihood, what our average will be. And this method should be constant. First thing I want to do is just check to see if I have any grades to average. So if grades empty is true, then that means there are no grades. So I could maybe print out a message again. I mean, it really depends. Maybe you just want to return 0. There may be no need to print out a message. Keep in mind that people don't watch software, or they don't always watch software. And our return value, of course, is just going to be 0. Now, of course, one problem is was the person's average really 0, or were there just no grades? So do we want to use some other return type here, like a negative value? One thing we didn't do in the read method is ensure that the grades were in range between 0 and 100. That might be an improvement. So now we have at least one grade. So let's declare a variable for summing the values in the array. And we're going to iterate over all of the elements of the array one by one. And for each one, we're going to add it to the sum. And when we finish adding them, then we can return the average. And the average is going to be the sum divided by size minus 1. Well, we need to return a double. Size minus 1 is going to give us an unsigned, and sum is an integer. I could have made that a double perhaps, but what I'm going to do is I am going to use static cast to cast size to a double, and that will force the floating point division of sum. Oh, I said size minus 1. We actually want to divide by size itself, because that is the number of actual grades we have. So size returns an unsigned. If I divided that into sum, I would do integer division. So what I need to do is I need to use static cast to cast size to a double. That gives me floating point division, and then I get the average of those numbers. That's the end of else, and that's the end of grades average. So the way we would use this in a program, well, let me just go ahead and create a new main. So if I've got int main, then I can declare an object of my grades class. And let's say I have grades in a file, and I can read them using read grades.dta. So it's going to read in the grades from this file, store them in the vector in this object. I can print them by calling the print method. And then finally, if I want to see the average, I can simply call the average method of the grades And this will print the average of the grades stored in the vector that is stored inside this grades. But what you want to do is, sure, you can use the methods of the vector class, but what I'm doing here is I'm actually encapsulating the vector in this grades class and then implementing methods that are appropriate for manipulating grades. And of course, if I were storing times or events or students in the vector, then I would want to implement methods that were appropriate for manipulating those objects or the vector of those objects.